In April 1946, a Japanese general stood blindfolded against a wooden post on a Philippine hillside, about to be shot by a firing squad, not for losing a war, but for winning one too brutally. His name was Masaharu Homma, and the story of how he got to that post is one of the most complex, haunting, and morally tangled war crimes trials in all of human history. Most people have never heard of Masaharu Homma. That's exactly the problem. While names like Tojo and Yamamoto dominate World War II history books, Homma sat in a quiet corner of infamy, a general who conquered the Philippines in just over 3 months, yet spent his final days insisting he never ordered the atrocity that destroyed his legacy forever. We're talking about the Bataan Death March. 76,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war, forced to walk 66 miles through jungle heat, denied water, beaten, and left to rot in the Philippine sun. Somewhere between 6,000 and 11,000 men died on that road. The exact number is still debated by historians today. But here's the question that haunted his trial, and still haunts military law scholars too. This day, can a commander be executed for crimes he claims he didn't know were happening? That question would define Homma's fate, and the answer will surprise you. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a video. I drop new content every week with the real stories behind history. Now, let's get into it. Before Masaharu Homma became the Butcher of Bataan, he was something almost nobody expects a poet. Born in 1887 on Sado Island, Japan, Homma grew up with a genuine love of Western culture. He wrote verse. He admired British literature. He spent time as a military attaché in London during the 1920s and came away deeply impressed by Western military values. His colleagues considered him almost too refined for Japanese military culture, a man who seemed more at home at a London dinner table than on a battlefield. He rose through the Imperial Japanese Army ranks steadily, but never without friction. Homma wasn't a fanatic. He didn't fit neatly into the ultra-nationalist mold that was consuming Japan in the 1930s. He openly opposed some of Japan's most aggressive military expansions. He had enemies in high places, so when Japan needed someone to conquer the Philippines in December 1941, why did they choose him? That answer reveals something dark about how the Japanese High Command actually operated, and it set the stage for everything that followed. On December 22, 1941, just 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Homma's 14th Army landed on Luzon. His orders were blunt: capture the Philippines within 50 days. The Imperial General Headquarters was so confident in a rapid victory that they had already scheduled his best troops to be transferred elsewhere before the campaign was even finished. What they didn't account for was General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur pulled a strategic masterstroke. He declared Manila an open city to prevent its destruction and retreated his forces onto the Bataan Peninsula. Suddenly, Homma's 50-day campaign turned into a 4-month siege. He was running out of men, supplies, and, most critically, time. Tokyo was furious. His reputation was on the line. Here's where the story takes a dark, almost Shakespearean turn. Because when Homma was finally reinforced and the Bataan Peninsula fell on April 9, 1942, he inherited a catastrophe he hadn't fully prepared for. 76,000 prisoners, starving, diseased, many already wounded, and an Imperial Japanese Army logistically unprepared to handle them. The plan was to march the prisoners north to Camp O'Donnell, a distance that would take roughly 6 days. Japanese military culture at the time viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace. A soldier was expected to die before being captured. That cultural mindset filtered down into how Japanese guards treated the prisoners. Not as men, to be protected under the Geneva Convention, but as an embarrassment to be managed. What followed was methodical brutality. Men who fell were bayoneted. Men who stopped to drink from a roadside stream were decapitated. American and Filipino soldiers watched their comrades executed for needing to rest. In one notorious incident, a group of Filipino officers were beheaded simply because a guard was in a violent mood that afternoon. The sun was unrelenting. The road was dusty, and the guards, some of them, were monsters wearing uniforms. But here's the detail that haunts historians. Homma, commanding the entire operation from his headquarters, later claimed he had no idea the march was happening in this way. He said his orders were for the prisoners to be treated humanely. He said the atrocities were committed by subordinates acting outside his orders. Was he lying? Or was he one of the most powerful men in the Philippines, genuinely that disconnected from what was happening 60 miles from his desk? After the fall of Bataan and the subsequent fall of Corregidor in May 1942, Homma governed the Philippines briefly. By late 1942, Tokyo had seen enough. His campaign had taken too long. He had embarrassed the imperial schedule. He was relieved of command and effectively put on the shelf, given no further wartime assignments for the rest of the war. This detail matters enormously. Homma didn't keep fighting. He didn't rack up more war crimes. He was politically sidelined, spending the war years in Japan, writing poetry and painting, the cultured, thoughtful man resurfacing in peacetime. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, American authorities began hunting for the architects of the war's worst atrocities. Homma's name came up immediately. MacArthur, the same man whose strategic retreat had prolonged the Bataan campaign, now had authority over the Tibl military tribunal that would judge Masaharu Homma. That conflict of interest would become one of the most controversial elements of the entire trial, because what happened next was, depending on who you ask, either justice or theater. The military tribunal began in Manila in January 1946. Homma's defense team, Japanese military officers with American civilian lawyers, to their credit, who genuinely fought for their client, argued three core points. First, that Homma had issued orders for humane treatment of prisoners. Second, that the atrocities were committed by subordinate officers acting without his knowledge or approval. Third, and most provocatively, that the trial itself was fundamentally compromised by MacArthur's personal role in the proceedings. The prosecution countered with something that was legally revolutionary at the time: the doctrine of command responsibility. The idea that a commanding general is legally responsible for the actions of forces under his command, even if he didn't order those actions directly, was relatively new in international law. It had been applied in the Yamashita trial just weeks before, and now it was being applied to Homma. The tribunal lasted 5 weeks. Witness after witness described scenes of extraordinary cruelty on the Death March road. Homma took the stand in his own defense, dignified, composed, consistent in his denials. The verdict: guilty. Sentence: death by firing squad. MacArthur reviewed the sentence and confirmed it without hesitation. Here's the detail that still generates debate among legal scholars 70 years later. 2 U.S. Supreme Court justices, Frank Murphy and Wiley Rutledge, dissented from the court's refusal to hear Homma's appeal. Murphy wrote a scathing dissent calling the tribunal a trial without precedent, where the accusers also served as judges. Rutledge agreed. Their dissents didn't save Homma, but they planted a seed that grew into modern international humanitarian law. On the night of April 2nd, 1946, Masaharu Homma wrote a final letter, allegedly, not to his jailers, not to his accusers, to the Filipino people. In it, he expressed what he called genuine sorrow for their suffering. He maintained, even at the very end, that he had not ordered the Death March atrocities. But he accepted the verdict, he accepted death. And in a gesture that surprised many of the American officers present, he did so with complete composure. His wife, Fujiko, a woman who had campaigned tirelessly for clemency, traveling to Manila, writing letters, pleading in person, was denied permission to see him in his final hours. She learned of his execution through a news broadcast. There's something unbearably human about that detail. A man who commanded armies, who conquered a nation, whose name was stamped into infamy. And the last human connection he reached for was a letter to the people who hated him most, while the woman who loved him sat alone, waiting for news that never came the way it should have. The Bataan Death March claimed thousands of lives. That is fact. That is horror. That demands accounting. But the question Homma's trial raised, and never fully resolved, was this: where does command responsibility end and individual guilt begin? The Nuremberg Principles, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, and eventually the Rome Statute, establishing the International Criminal Court, all grappled with this question. Homma's trial, and the Yamashita trial before it, became the uncomfortable foundation stones of modern international law on command responsibility. What's remarkable is that the doctrine born from these flawed, contested, politically compromised trials became one of the most important legal tools for prosecuting war crimes in the 21st century. From Rwanda to the former Yugoslavia, commanders have been held responsible for atrocities they claimed not to have ordered, because two bitterly controversial tribunals in Manila established the principle. Was Homma guilty? Military historians remain divided. Some argue the evidence clearly shows he knew enough to be responsible. Others contend he was executed in a process designed more to satisfy MacArthur's vengeance than to deliver genuine justice. What isn't divided is the outcome. Tens of thousands of men suffered on a 66-mile road in April 1942. Whether Homma ordered every blow, sanctioned the brutality, or simply failed to prevent what his army became in the absence of clear orders, those men were under his command. That road existed because of his conquest. And that reality followed him to a wooden post on a Philippine hillside, on a quiet April morning, 58 years after he was born, writing poetry on an island off the coast of Japan. The firing squad fired at dawn. Masaharu Homma, general, poet, conqueror, defendant, died at 58 years old. Whether he was a war criminal, a scapegoat, or something deeply, uncomfortably in between, is a question history has never fully closed. And maybe that's the most important lesson Darkroom Archive can leave you with today. The darkest chapters of history are almost never simple. The monsters are rarely just monsters, and justice, real, clean, uncompromised justice, is sometimes the hardest thing to find in the aftermath of war. If this video made you think, share it with someone who deserves to know this story. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you land on Homma's guilt, and we'll see you in the next one.